Hi, I would like to talk about Things Fall Apart, which was written by Chinua Achebe in 1958. And in this presentation, I will touch upon colonialism and post-colonialism, and then I will characterize the two main characters and in the text, and then I will put the portrayal in reference to other text and discuss the portrayal and the point of view. And then I will discuss Achebe's writing style and how it has affected this text. And Things Fall Apart was written in 1958. And just to quickly summarize it, we know it takes place during the 1890s in an Igbo city called Umofia, which was a British colony at the time. And the main character, who's called Okonkwo, is an African traditionalist who comes back from a 7-year exile. And he was in exile because he killed a boy by accident. And when he comes back to the village, he expected to find it as he left it. But to his despair, he figures out that that a lot has changed due to a white missionary called Mr. Brown. And the text is kind of about how colonialism has affected African tradition, and how imperialism and European influence in general has changed the culture in Africa. And now I will characterize the two main characters, and I'm sorry, but I think I have to remove myself from the picture now. Hi, I'm sorry, this was really the best I could do, so you'll have to excuse the clutter in the background. But to characterize Okonkwo, Okonkwo is the main character of the story, and he is, as I mentioned, an African traditionalist. And he resents Mr. Brown's ideas, and he does not cope well with him. In fact, he's one of the only people in the village who does not wish to speak to him. And he's one of the only ones. He says, as soon as he had learned of Okonkwo's return 5 months earlier, the missionary had immediately paid him a visit. But Okonkwo had driven him away with the threat that if he ever came to the compound again, he would be carried out of it. And that is a contrast to the other people in the village who have taken to his ideas. Okonkwo also relies on his strength and his masculinity. It says he mourned, the very last lines of the extract says, he mourned for the clan which he saw breaking up and falling apart, and he mourned for the warlike men of Umofia who had so unaccountably become soft like women. So here we see that his traditional values are not regarded as highly anymore, and he blames colonization and Mr. Brown for that change. And it's not really weird if you look at it from Okonkwo's perspective that he would think that, and that he resents Mr. Brown's idea because, as I mentioned, he is a white missionary. But with accommodation and compromise, he kind of wins over this community, and he does not force or thrust the idea of Western culture upon them. It says, and so Mr. Brown came to be respected even by the clan because he trod softly on its faith. So here we see that this compromise actually works. And it is enhanced heavily in a conversation he has about religion with a great man from the village who is called Akuna. It says, neither of them succeeded in converting the other, but they learned more about their different beliefs. So so here we see that it's a constructive conversation, and how this accommodation and compromise gets put into practice. And there's also another thing that's interesting in this conversation about religion, and that's that Achebe meddles African and European culture. It says that Achebe uses his Christian knowledge when Mr. Brown says this to Akuna. You said one interesting thing. You are afraid of Chukwu. In my religion, Chukwu is a loving father and need not be feared by those who do his will. And Chukwu refers to the highest of the Igbo gods. And then Achebe uses his Igbo knowledge when Akuna counteracts with this. But we must fear him when we are not doing his will. And who is to tell his will? It is too great to be known. And here I think it's relevant to talk about the 3 C's, which is commerce, Christianity, and civilization. And this was the motto of British explorer David Livingstone. And you can see that Mr. Brown has taken to these, but in contrast to how some may view it, he does not, as I mentioned, thrust it upon them. And because he does this, he managed to persuade this African village and community to send their kids to school and to attend his church services. And he ends up being praised. It says that they gave him. It says at some point in the text that they give him a carved elephant tusk, which is a sign of dignity and rank. And again, this shows again how Achebe melds European and African culture. And when he leaves, his departure is mourned, and not only by the village but also by Mr. Brown himself. It says, but in the end he had to leave his flock sad and broken. And another interesting thing is that it says that it was the first rain of the season that Mr. Brown left for home. And I think that's interesting because rain usually indicates sadness. And this is not the typical picture we see of in literature about Africa and colonialism, because I think it's showing the culture class in a good way. And we clearly understand both Okonkwo and Mr. Brown. And that's very different, and that's very atypical, because it's not really one of the other, but it's both, and they are dimensional and well-rounded characters. And there are really no flat characters in this text, and that's very different from the other texts, some of the other texts we've read, because it's not really the condescending portrayal we see in Band Aid's Christmas song, Do They Know It's Christmas, from 1984. Because even though their intentions might be great, it becomes very condescending. It says, do they know it's Christmas time at all? Even though Ethiopia, which was the country they primarily targeted, is one of the countries with the oldest Christian tradition in the world, actually. And so they should know it's Christmas. And they also say that the only water flowing is the bitter sting of tears at some point, and that creates this dystopian and ultimately false narrative about Africa. There is this thing called white savior complex, which actually derives from Rudyard Kipling's poem White Man's Burden from 1899. And the white savior complex kind of describes a white person helping a non-white person, but it's ultimately for the white person's own benefit. So here I've just taken an extract from White Man's Burden. It says, take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And here we see how it's a burden, but he has to do it. But the novel doesn't try to condemn one of the persons either, like we see in The Tempest, for example, where Caliban must conform to survive. So it does not really praise or condemn, but we clearly see, because we are shown that there are faults with each system, and as I mentioned, that's an interesting perspective. And before I get to Achebe's writing style, I'd just like to mention the historical context of the story, because there is, of course, the first one, which is the colonization of Africa in the late 19th century, in which the story takes place. But the story was written in 1958, just as European powers were giving up their colonies. So Achebe because Achebe is from Nigeria, and Achebe kind of finds himself divided between these two worlds, just like Okonkwo in the novel does. And we can see this division in his writing style, I think. In The Role of the Writer, which he wrote in 2012, Achebe also, he says that he uses the colonizer's tools, his language altered sufficiently to bear the of an African creative aesthetic infused with elements of the African literary tradition. And this we can see in Things Fall Apart, as I mentioned earlier. And he also says in an interview with Bill Moyers, he states that if there's one point of view, fine, there will be a second point of view. And that refers to both Okonkwo and Mr. Brown. So it becomes this very honest depiction of their characters. And and also in the Moyers interview, he says, I am concerned about the story, about the people whose story I'm telling. That's the same as the quote before. In in The Role of the Writer, he also states that a major objective was to challenge stereotypes, myths, and the image of ourselves and our continent, and to recast them through stories. And he manages to do that because ultimately the novel manages to convey an honest and important portrait, because this novel was really the first of its kind. And it gives like mostly European people a new perception of Africa. And Achebe says that himself. He says, "Look at Africa as a country of people, just people. They are not devils, they are not angels, they are just people."